Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Gillian Askew. I'm one of three co-founders of Go for Growth, and I'm one of your hosts for this morning's session. I'm joined by my colleague Annalise Fothergill from YPO, who is part of the contracts team. So thank you, Annalise, for joining us today. Just to make sure that everybody is in the right place, we are talking about frameworks and dynamic markets this morning. So it's great to see so many of you joining us today. We had a lot of people sign up for this. So thank you for taking time out of what I'm sure are very busy calendars to join us. So what we're covering today on frameworks and dynamic markets, we're going to look a little bit at framework agreements. We'll look at dynamic markets, what they are, how they've evolved from the dynamic purchasing system. Think about key features, the process flow and decision guide that procurers are getting as guidance, and we'll think about what the benefits of both these constructs are for businesses, especially for smaller organisations. We'll finish up with what help is available for people, and then we will have time for, hopefully have time for questions and some discussion at the end. So a little bit of housekeeping, and we'll do some intros in a second before we get started. So we are in Zoom, as you know. I'm just going to check that the chat functionality is enabled for everybody. Let me just make sure it is. So everybody should be able to use the chat functionality. Please feel free, if you would like to say hi and introduce yourself on the chat. The Q&A functionality is also there, so please do feel free to use that also if you want, or you can use the chat. Annalise and I will try and keep an eye on those as we go through. We have carved out some time, hopefully, for questions at the end. In the unlikely event that we don't quite have time for Q&A at the end, our contact details are there as well, so you can get in touch with us. We do have a hand up already. Anna, if you would like to just talk, is there something that you would like to say, Anna? Nope. Okay, I will just crack on. I'm just getting to that actually. Yeah, so you will receive a copy of the recording that we make today, and a copy of the slide deck will be sent out. If it's not today, at the very latest, it will be tomorrow. So that will all be shared with you. Do feel free, as I say, to pitch in as we go through, or we'll have questions at the end if we get time. There is an awful lot to cover this morning, so it is a really high-level, quick canter through. So if anybody would like to have a more detailed discussion with either myself or Annalise, you can get in touch with us through the YPO contact details or the Go for Growth contact details, which are at the end of the slide deck. So quick introductions. I am Gillian Askew. I am a procurement professional by trade, one of three co-founders of Go for Growth, and Go for Growth is helping smaller organisations and voluntary sector organisations to take part in public sector opportunities. Annalise, I'll hand over to you to do your intro, if that's okay.
It is. Thank you, Gillian. My name is Annalise Fothergill, and I'm an experienced contract officer at YPO. My role involves ensuring that all YPO contracting activity is undertaken compliantly and in line with the relevant legislation, regulations, policies and procedures. I offer advice, guidance and training in my role and support buyers with their tendering activities.
Thank you, Annalise.
So I'm just conscious that some of you might not have heard of YPO before, so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a background information about who we are. So YPO stands for the Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation. We are based in Wakefield, but we do operate nationally. We were formed in 1974 and we've just celebrated our 50th year last year. We are one of the largest UK public sector buying organisations. We are owned by 13 local authorities across Yorkshire and the North West who came together to combine their buying demands and achieve greater efficiencies. Whilst we do tender for contracts in our own right, YPO also put in place frameworks and other solutions for public sector customers to use. We have a wealth of procurement experience and provide support from our dedicated category teams to guide customers with their procurement requirements. YPO are 100% publicly owned and are a not-for-profit organisation. So everything we do is about giving back to the public sector. And since we were formed in 1974, YPO have given back 164 million to the public sector through member dividends. So now I'm just going to talk you through frameworks, what they are, when they can be used. So under the Procurement Act 2023, frameworks can be established under either the open procedure or the competitive flexible procedure. And there are two types of frameworks that can be established. There's a closed framework, which is similar to what we currently have, that can last for up to 4 years, and an open framework, which is new. So let me explain a little bit more about what a framework is and how they operate. So frameworks can be used for both common and/or complex requirements. They usually comprise of a list of suppliers with standardized contract terms. So the framework itself is a form of an umbrella agreement with suppliers which sets out the general terms and conditions under which goods, works or services can be purchased throughout the period of the framework agreement. Frameworks are often divided by products or services or types, or sometimes by region. For example, you might have a framework for writing equipment, and lot 1 might be for ballpoint pens, lot 2 might be for gel pens, and lot 3 might be for permanent markers. So you get an idea of how they're usually structured. When a public sector body needs a service or product, they typically call off from a framework, often through a mini competition among framework suppliers. The call-off contract sets out the specific terms for purchasing the goods or services to meet the customer requirements, including the volume and price to be paid. So for public sector contracting authorities, including schools, using a framework ensures that the buying process is fully compliant with the UK procurement legislation, and all suppliers listed on frameworks will have been assessed during the procurement process for their financial stability, track record, experience and professional ability. So we've already done that due diligence work. So a framework is a bit like a supermarket. So you go in, you can browse round, you've got no obligation to buy, and a customer can come along with their shopping list of what they need. They can look around the supermarket, work out what's best for them, and then it's only when they take their goods to the checkout that the call of contract will be formed. So that's just give you an idea of the difference between the framework itself and a call of contract. So the framework constitutes less risk for the public sector and presents a lighter touch way of securing the right suppliers. So when resources and/or budgets are under pressure, a framework can offer real value for money and an easier route for public sector buyers, as a lot of the due diligence work has already been undertaken. So let's give you an overview of the process of setting up a framework. So a public sector organisation will issue the tender for a particular category of goods, works or services. For example, the writing equipment that I talked about earlier. Suppliers will submit bids in response to the tender requirements to be included in the framework. The public sector organisation will then assess the bids in line with the methodology and process set out in the tender documents, and then successful bidders will be then listed as approved supplier for a fixed period, which is typically between 2 and 4 years. So as we've said, being on that framework does not guarantee any work, but it does give you the opportunity to compete to win contracts. So like the supermarket, the customer can see what's out there and there's no obligation on them to purchase. So on a closed framework, the supplier is appointed onto the framework for a fixed duration. This is usually for 4 years, and once awarded, no new suppliers can join. However, under the Procurement Act 2023, a new open framework has been established, and this can be created provided there's more than 2 suppliers on it, and it can last for up to 8 years, provided it's reopened for new suppliers to join at least twice, once during the first 3 years from the award, and at least one more time during a period of 5 years from the second award. So if at any stage there's only one supplier on the framework, the term is then capped at 4 years from the point at which the open framework becomes a single supplier framework. Now, this remains the case even if when you reopen that framework, more than one supplier then rejoins. So you just need to be aware of that difference. Usually there is no limit on the number of times a framework can be reopened. but this should be clearly identified at the start of the process within the tender documents so all bidders are aware. There's also usually no limit of a number of suppliers who can join a framework, although contracting authorities can usually decide to limit the number of suppliers to be awarded a place. Usually this is dependent upon their ability to be able to manage the framework moving forward. But again, all this will be made clear in the initial documentation for the framework. So when an open framework is reopened, as a supplier on the framework, you have a choice. You can either rebid again to rejoin the framework, or you can ask for your original bid and score to be used from the original framework submission. Now, Gillian's going to talk us through how the open framework works in a little while. So let's look at the different ways that suppliers might be awarded a contract under a framework once it's been set up. So call of contracts might be awarded with or without competition between suppliers on the framework. And there's two ways that this can happen. By an award without competition, and this replaces the current direct award system, or through a competitive selection process. So let me explain a little bit more about the differences. A competitive selection process is used when a contracting authority carries out a competition for the award of a call of contract to find the right supplier for their specific requirements. It will usually involve inviting all suppliers awarded to a specific lot to respond to the customer's requirements. The contracting authority will then assess all responses received in line with the assessment methodology that's set out in the documents. So this is very similar to the current mini competition or further competition process under the Public Contract Regulations 2015. Typically, there may be some deviation in scoring weightings from the framework establishment stage, but this should be within the agreed tolerance that is set out in the framework documents. The main reasons why customers will undertake competitive selection process will be to test out pricing. So it may well be that they're wanting to buy in bulk and they're wanting to try and secure a better price, or it might be that they've got really complex requirements where you just need to be able to see what the suppliers can offer in response to your complex requirements. Now, the other way in which contracts can be awarded under a framework is with an award without competition. And this is where no competitive selection process is run, but a supplier can be directly awarded to under the framework agreement in line with the objective mechanism set out in the framework documentation. So you might ask, well, what is an objective mechanism? So it might be where, so it can be used for supplier selection, and it might be used like a taxi rank system where a call of contract are awarded on a rotational basis, or it could be on a highest ranking system with a limitation on the number or value of call of contracts to be awarded to any one supplier. So for example, once the highest ranking supplier reaches their cap, the next ranked supplier would be awarded the next call of contract, and so on. So the framework agreement should make it clear if this is an option and under what terms. Typically, these will be on the call of terms and conditions set out within the framework documentation, and they usually cannot be amended. The prices submitted at framework stage or on any permitted price refresh points will be used for an award without competition. So an award without competition replaces the current direct award process under the Public Contract Regulations 2015. And Jill's now going to talk us through how an open framework works when suppliers have the choice to either rebid or take through their initial scores from the framework stage.
Perfect. Thanks, Annalise. We have just quickly had something in the chat. I think one of our attendees is struggling with their volume. So yes, the recording will be sent out to everybody. So if that's you, please don't worry, you will get it. So I'll just go back to what Annalise was just saying a second ago. In an open framework, when it reopens, if you are on that framework, you have a choice to make. About whether you want to use the original scoring from your original framework submission, or if you want to resubmit at that point. And so we've just got an illustration to show you that might hopefully help bring this to life a little bit. So For argument's sake, on this example, we're going to assume that the framework is limited to 3 suppliers on it. So what we've got are our existing 3 suppliers. And they are all making that choice that Annalise talked about. So supplier 1 is going to maintain the scores from framework 1 submission. Supplier 2, an existing supplier, has submitted a new tender to be assessed, and so has supplier 3. But in addition to those 3 existing suppliers, there's also 2 new suppliers who are using that refresh point, that reopening point, to submit a new bid to be assessed. So we've now got 5 suppliers and we are looking for 3 spaces on the tender. So if I pull up the scores, and this is how, this is all obviously just an exercise for today. So framework 1 score for supplier 1 was 85% and their new score was 85%. The second supplier who resubmitted a new tender, they scored 72 originally and their new score was 75. Supplier 3, their original score was 70%, their new tender score was 65. No original framework scores, obviously, for the new suppliers. They scored 74 and 70% respectively. And so what that actually means is, in that particular example, suppliers A, B, and then D would be awarded those 3 places on that framework. And existing supplier C, who retendered, was actually, they would lose their place on the framework, and supplier 5, who was a new supplier in there, was not awarded a place, because the top 3 scores are the suppliers that are then on that framework. And so that's trying to illustrate, if you're a small business on the call, the open framework is a great construct in that, as Annalise said, now on a closed framework, if you're not on it, there isn't an opportunity to get on it for the duration of that contract. Of course, the open framework does give that opportunity. It does give you the opportunity also to resubmit new scores if you have new pricing or new services, or a new part of your offering. But it does also come with some risk that you may not be successful and you may lose your place as new suppliers are appointed to it. So hopefully that visual was a useful way of illustrating how that open framework functionality should work going forward. Annalise, back over to you.
Thank you, Gillian. So under the Procurement Act 2023, transparency is weaved throughout, with new obligations to publish notices at various stages throughout the procurement lifecycle. Some notices are optional for contracting authorities, such as the planned procurement notice, but the majority will be mandatory. And the amount of notices is certainly increasing from the current Public Contract Regulations 2015. So the planned procurement notice is similar to a current pipeline notice in that it provides advance notice of any upcoming procurements to allow suppliers the maximum time for preparation. It is the only type of notice that, when used correctly, can provide a reduction in the minimum time periods between submission of a tender notice and the deadline for submission of tenders in a competitive tendering procedure. And that is because you've already had some notice of what that procurement will look like. Now, a preliminary market engagement notice is used to engage with the market. If not undertaken, it needs to be explained why in your tender notice. So most contracting authorities should now be undertaking market engagement to engage with suppliers, gain a greater understanding of what they can offer and any challenges that are in the market. So the tender notice is the equivalent of a current contract notice and is used to inform the market that a tender has been advertised. It should also be reissued on the reopening of an open framework, so new suppliers can join at any time. So an assessment summary should also be provided to suppliers with details of how they scored against each of the criteria when they've submitted a tender and it has been assessed. The assessment summary should also give the reasons for the score given. It should be provided to unsuccessful suppliers, and it should also include a copy of the information provided to the successful supplier which can be redacted for confidentiality where required. So a supplier reading the two sets of information alongside one another should be able to ascertain the relative advantages of the winning supplier. So the assessment summaries replace the current award letters. So once assessment summaries have been issued, a contract award notice is then needed when awarding a framework and on the award of any subsequent reopening of the framework. It should also be issued on the award of a call of contract under a framework. A contract notice announces the intention to enter into a public contract and initiates the standstill period. It also gives details of the suppliers to be awarded under the public contract. Whereas a contract details notice announces that the contract has been entered into and provides key information about the contract. If the call of contract is valued over 5 million, the contracting authority must also publish a copy of the contract and state at least 3 key performance indicators that the call of contract will be monitored against. In such situation, a contract performance notice must also be issued annually to give details of the supplier's performance against the KPIs. Okay. So dynamic markets are new under the Procurement Act 2023, and eventually they will replace the dynamic purchasing systems. Dynamic markets will not be restricted to commonly procured goods, as the Act recognises that they can be used in a greater variety of situations. So this will enable the public sector to create marketplaces for potentially anything. So what are dynamic markets? Well, they are electronic systems designed to provide a flexible and open mechanism for engaging with suppliers. Unlike traditional frameworks that allow suppliers to join at any point, making them particularly useful in markets where innovation is rapid, new entrants are frequent. They are an entirely electronic process and offer a paperless way of working. Dynamic markets should only be used for above threshold spend. So how will they work? Well, dynamic markets operate as a live, continuously open system. Once established, buyers can issue specific procurement opportunities within the market, which allow suppliers to bid and compete. Suppliers must meet the initial qualification criteria to join, but they can apply at any time, ensuring that the market remains accessible and responsive. So let's look at how they might be different from frameworks. Now, there's 3 key distinctions. They allow continuous entry. So frameworks are closed to new suppliers after being established. Even with an open framework, they are usually closed for that period of time before they're reopened, whereas dynamic markets allow suppliers to join at any time. Another difference is that there's no duration limit. Whilst frameworks are usually capped at 4 years for a closed framework or 8 years for an open framework, dynamic markets do not have a maximum term, so they can be in the marketplace for a lot longer, which will offer greater longevity and adaptability. Another key difference is they offer a simplified supplier engagement process. So the process for entering and participating in a dynamic market is a lot less restrictive and is more streamlined compared to frameworks. So let's have a look at when they can be used. So dynamic markets are ideal in scenarios where maybe the market's changing rapidly and new suppliers or innovation are expected to emerge frequently. They are useful in circumstances where the contracting authority might want to maintain a broad or competitive supply base over time, because we know that that supply base is going to change. There is a need for high flexibility with reduced barriers for entry. So it is important to note that when establishing a dynamic market, you still have transparency requirements. You still need to advertise its setup and manage the participation process electronically, ensuring equal opportunities for all suppliers. For businesses, particularly SMEs, dynamic markets are a gateway to access public sector contracts more easily. They offer lower bureaucracy, continuous opportunities, and offer a quicker turnaround in relation to the time it takes to evaluate that initial application to join the dynamic market. So they create a more level playing field. So dynamic markets align closely with modern procurement needs. They offer flexibility, innovation, and inclusivity. They reflect an approach that seeks to meet evolving market demands while supporting a diverse supplier ecosystem. So dynamic markets are actually a two-stage process. So the first stage is where suppliers who meet the conditions for entry are admitted to it. There will be no request for pricing information at this stage, nor will you be required to answer any award questions. So the dynamic market will usually be established using categories that may be defined by reference to specific types of work, services, or supplies, or by reference to a geographical area or region. If you are unsuccessful at the first stage and do not meet the conditions for entry, you can ask for feedback and reapply again at any point. Now, the second stage of the dynamic market is the call-off process, where a competitive selection process is undertaken. So when an opportunity is advertised via a tender notice, it must state that the procurement is for an award of a public contract under a dynamic market. So this will allow providers who are not currently on the dynamic market an opportunity to submit an application to join, and then they can obviously then respond to the opportunity. So you're not actually locked out. This second stage is undertaken under a competitive flexible procedure, as participants must be a member of the dynamic market to be awarded a contract under it, and therefore an open procedure is just not permitted. So in this second stage, suppliers will be invited to submit responses to meet the requirements of the public sector organisation, which will then be assessed in line with the assessment methodology set out in the call-off opportunity documentation. This will usually involve asking for pricing information and respond to award questions. For example, please explain the customer service support you can offer and how you can meet any urgent requests for products including timescales. So suppliers on the dynamic market can actually be reassessed at any point to check whether they are excluded or an excludable supplier, in which case they might be removed from the dynamic market. They should also be checked regularly to ensure they're not on any debarment lists. And if you are on any debarment lists, you may be removed from the dynamic market. And you could also be asked to still demonstrate that you can meet the conditions of participation and entry. So it might well be that one of the requirements is that you have an ISO certification. And if you don't currently have that certification, you may be removed if you no longer meet those criteria.
Thanks, Annalise. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, actually. One I'm going to try and take at the end, but one is quite pertinent to what you were talking about. So the question is, in the dynamic market, as it's only used above threshold, does that mean that the total value of the dynamic market is the thing that has to be over threshold, or does each of those competitive awards that call off from the dynamic market also have to be over threshold as well?
So for a dynamic market, it's when you're going out to tender under the dynamic market. So it's at call-off stage. That is the important amount for the value. So if it is under threshold, for the call-off opportunity, you will not be able to use a dynamic market. It needs to be over threshold at the call-off point. And
Okay.
the value of the dynamic market itself will be, it should include the potential value of all the call-off opportunities added together. So the value of the dynamic market itself is not the amount of money that you can, or amount of business that you can actually win under it. It's the total opportunities that might be available.
Brilliant. Thank you. That's really helpful and really clear. Thank you, Annalise. I'll move you on.
Okay, thank you. So dynamic markets also have notices that must be used throughout its life. This includes the advertisement stage through publishing of a dynamic market intention notice before the dynamic market is established, which should include things like information about the goods, services, or works being procured, what the conditions of membership are, the categories, parts, or lots associated with the dynamic market, who can access the dynamic market and use it, and information about the charging of any fees under the dynamic market, which Gillian will come on to shortly. The information provided in this notice should be sufficient to enable suppliers to determine whether they meet the conditions of membership and let them to decide whether it's something that they think they may be able to offer under the dynamic market, to enable them to decide if they want to join or not. Now, notices then need to be published on the establishment of a dynamic market, which should include the date the dynamic market was established and details of the suppliers who have been admitted and which lots or categories the suppliers have been admitted to. Notices also need to be issued on any changes or modification to the dynamic markets, including if any new suppliers have been added or removed, and also notices need to be issued on the termination of the dynamic market. So there's still quite a lot of notices that still need to be issued under a dynamic market. So dynamic markets can only be used by contracting authorities with above threshold spend, which is different from a dynamic purchasing system. So currently it is not permitted to restrict the submission of tenders by suitability for under threshold contracts. So suitability includes areas such as suppliers' legal, financial and technical ability. And these are the areas that are currently used to assess bidder suitability to join a dynamic market, and only those that meet the criteria are accepted onto the dynamic market. So this is why a dynamic market cannot be used for under threshold spend currently. However, the Cabinet Office does recognise that this could be an issue for some contracting authorities and are exploring ways to address this for the future. So I think it's a case of they recognise this could be an issue and it's a case of just watching to see what they do next. However, current dynamic purchasing systems will be around, we know, until February 2029, which gives a further route to market for contracting authorities to utilise for any under threshold spend currently.
Thank you, Annalise. That's great. So we'll pick up on some of the key features of frameworks versus dynamic markets in this slide. So on a framework, the two types of framework that Annalise has kindly talked us through, a closed framework has a maximum duration of 4 years and an open framework has a maximum duration of 8 years. That is reliant on there being at least 2 suppliers on the framework throughout that duration. Otherwise, that duration can change if there is only 1 supplier on it. And it's also worth just letting people know that if an open framework isn't refreshed and re-awarded by the end of that year 3 point, it would automatically become a closed framework, and then the maximum duration would be 4 years. In terms of supplier numbers, on a framework, there is no minimum and no maximum on a closed framework. On an open framework, as I've just mentioned, there is a minimum of 2 suppliers for it to meet the criteria to be an open framework for its duration. And on a dynamic market, there's no minimum or maximum number of suppliers either. And in terms of flexibility to add on a closed framework, as probably lots of people will be familiar with, once that closed framework is let, there is no flexibility to add new suppliers to that framework. But with the open framework at those refresh points, and I think I'm right in saying, Annalise, correct me if I'm wrong, there must be those 2 reopen points, but there could be more refreshes than the 2. But it's the refreshes that create that flexibility and openness of the framework if it's an open framework. And again, the duration is linked to how many suppliers are on it. And as Annalise has said, in a dynamic market, its nature is that it's always open. So continuous entry is allowed to a dynamic market. In terms of process flow, the process usually begins by publishing a planned procurement notice, which is optional, followed by conducting the pre-market engagement and publishing a notice to inform the market of that. A tender notice and then all associated documents are published to invite participation. And during the tender stage, it's essential that contracting authorities observe the participation stages and ensure that the timelines are being adhered to. And in any public procurement, what you should find in those initial invitation to tender documents, that all of the information in terms of access points, selection criteria, exclusion, etc., timescales, it's all there for you. So you should always know upfront what the participation stages are and what the tendering period timescales are. Suppliers will then be assessed, or bidders will then be assessed for their eligibility, exclusion, or excludability before moving on to the actual tender assessment. Once the assessments have been done, a contract award notice and a detailed contract notice are published, as Annalise has talked us through. And then finally, the framework involves that ongoing management or contract performance, including any modifications or, where applicable, any termination of that contract. So it's a very logical flow. And actually, one of our observations of the Procurement Act is the transparency regime also backs up that very logical flow of what we should see as suppliers going into the market. And if anybody is wondering on the call where those notices will be, the central digital platform, which is an extension to the Find a Tender service, is where all of those notices will be. So the good news is all of those things will be in one place. And we do have to register for it as suppliers and bidders, but we will only have to go to one place to find all of that information out, which is useful. And what are the kind of things that contracting authorities will be considering in terms of whether they go for a framework or a dynamic market? One of the things that procurers often look at is what is the current market condition. So if it's a stable or even stagnant market without much movement in it, as Annalise said, dynamic markets are really good where you've got lots of change, lots of innovation, and lots of suppliers joining a market. If you don't have those conditions, then a framework might be the right construct for a contracting authority to use. But where you have got emerging services or goods, or where you are being innovative, or where you've got consistent new entrants to a market, then a dynamic market might be the best construct for that. When you're considering about the limitation on suppliers, if you do want to limit suppliers, then an open framework would be a good route to go through. If you don't want to limit suppliers, then actually a dynamic market might be good. So you can keep adding those suppliers to it as you want to. As Annalise said as well, in a dynamic market, we don't always get through the first time. So in a dynamic market, you can take that feedback, work on your submission and try again. So you don't have to only have one go and then be counted out. And then I guess as a contracting authority, you'll assess the capacity to assess those applications continuously. We shouldn't underestimate actually the amount of work that goes into managing a dynamic market. If there is some limitation on that capacity, then a dynamic market might not be the thing to do. So if you've got capacity, great, a dynamic market is fantastic. If you haven't, then perhaps a framework or an open framework might be the better product for a contracting authority to use. And I think it's worth for us as suppliers to understand some of the things that sit underneath of these processes and the management of those processes. And in terms of fees and charging, so the owner of a framework or a dynamic market may charge suppliers a fixed percentage fee of the estimated contracts awarded to them under the framework or dynamic market. But what isn't allowed is that you can't be charged as a supplier just to gain access to either a framework or a dynamic market. The fees have got to be set upfront and stated in the tender or dynamic market notice, so that must be clear and very transparent, and it cannot change during the lifetime of that framework or market. So what you should pay, if you are paying anything at all, is a percentage fee of work that you've been awarded, not a fee to actually join the product in the first place. So and that's hopefully helpful in making the distinction in terms of what fees are permissible and what you might find as a supplier that you are being asked to pay as a fee. And then just the last couple of things, really. These webinars are we have both buyers and suppliers on lots of these webinars. But one of the things for certainly the small business market is, why are these things good constructs for smaller organisations? As Annalise said, there are simplified routes into them. So whilst a framework has no guarantee of work, neither does a dynamic market. Just joining them doesn't create the guarantee of work. But what you are doing, especially on a framework, is reducing that competitive marketplace size. So when the competition is run to call off the work or award without competition, so what was the direct award capability, it is in the construct or the context of who's on that framework for that lot. And so the market is reduced, your competitive market is smaller, and it is a simpler access route into it. Also, it can give you some predictability and stability, because actually once those call-off contracts are in place, they will run for a period of time, and that will give some financial or economic stability potentially for smaller organisations. And they can be really useful actually for reputational build and for showcasing some of those things that are tested in selection processes around our economic and financial standing and our technical capability and capacity. So joining frameworks is often a real positive, just for showing that we are playing in that marketplace. And the mini competitions, the further competitions, whatever the terminology is that the contracting authority uses, they are usually a much more streamlined process. So a smaller competition, I guess it is what it says on the tin, it's a mini version of the competition. And so usually a lighter touch process for actually being awarded a call-off contract. And the benefits of a dynamic market are actually just really clear. They are always open. So there is that easier and continuous entry to a dynamic market in the first place. And that gives a smaller organisation some flexibility and scalability. And one of the things is, as a competition is run, you don't have to bid for it. So you can choose what you bid for in terms of call-off competitions from a dynamic market. As Annalise said, there is less bureaucracy, there are lower entry barriers, and so that's simplified process of joining the dynamic market is easier and more accessible and therefore more inclusive. And what we tend to find is that there are more frequent opportunities and quicker turnaround of those call-offs from a dynamic market. That's what we expect to see. And so therefore it can be quite helpful, I think, in levelling the playing field. They're a good mechanism for smaller organisations. It will be interesting, as Annalise said, to see what the Cabinet Office do with below threshold opportunities. Dynamic purchasing systems have been really useful for below threshold opportunities, but there is that point of you can't deselect under threshold, and so the dynamic market as it's currently set up wouldn't be able to be used under threshold. So it'd be interesting to see what the Cabinet Office do with that as we get closer to the go live date, which I'm sure everybody does know, but for anyone who isn't aware, the D-Day, the go live day is the 24th of next month, so 24th of February this year. And all signs are saying that we will go live on that date. And the final thing just to say before we open up for questions is if you are a supplier or even a procurement team, this can often feel like a massive mountain to climb. Public procurement processes are complicated and complex. It's a regulated process, and it is right and proper that scrutiny and governance and transparency are alive and well. If you need some help, though, please don't feel like you're on your own. The contact details for YPO are on there, and Go for Growth. If you want to chat to us, to either of us, please do get in touch. If you want to set up a session with me at Go for Growth, you can book through the bookable calendar on there, or you can go to our website and get lots of information as well, as you can with YPO. And I know we're almost at time, but I will just open up for questions and I will stop sharing and just see if we've got anything in the chat as well. I can see we do have one hand raised, so let me see if I can get you, Lorna. If I can work. Lorna, if you do want to ask a question, please go ahead while I have a look at the chat. So I don't think we're going to get through all of these questions in the minute that we've got left. What I might suggest then, because we've got some good questions in there, is to take the questions away. We get a download of the chat and Annalise and I will have a look at them and we'll put together some appropriate answers to those questions and send them out with the slide deck and the recording, which will probably be tomorrow, just to give us time to have a look through the questions in the chat, if that's okay with everybody. You can't see the questions, so in the Q&A, you can't see the questions because they're in the chat. So it depends on whether the person talking in the chat functionality has posed it either to hosts and panelists only or to everybody. So if you have a look in the chat, you'll be able to see what is live in there as well. If that's all right with everyone, I know time is the most precious commodity that everyone's got, so we won't hold anyone up. We are over by a minute, but hopefully that was really useful. Annalise, that was brilliant. Thank you ever so much for giving up your time for us this morning. We'll have a look at the questions in the chat and we'll get everything out to everybody. So have a great rest of your Tuesday, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us and we'll see you on the next one, hopefully.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone. Thank you.